The frozen dawn of December 15th, 1834, found Samuel Hayes watching his brother die. Picture that moment, if you will. The temperature had plunged to what we would call -20 degrees Fahrenheit. Their hastily built autumn shelter really just logs chinked with mud, and hope had collapsed under 40 inches of snow sometime during the night. The weight of winter had literally crushed their home, and now hypothermia was claiming its price, one labored breath at a time. Across the Colorado Rockies, this story repeated itself like some grim seasonal ritual. Mountain men huddled in caves they'd enlarged with pickaxes and prayer. Families crowded into shared cabins, 3 or 4 families to a single room, all waiting for spring's permission to build again. The Shoshone had a phrase for these months. Asterisk. The time when lodges stand still. Asterisk. And frontier wisdom, learned through frozen corpses and collapsed roofs, had carved one unbreakable rule in stone. Never ever disturb the frozen earth between November and March. Now, you have to understand something about this rule. It wasn't superstition. It was survival mathematics. When the ground freezes solid, digging becomes impossible without fire. Building materials become brittle. Mortar won't set. And most critically, any structure you tried to erect would be built on unstable, heaving ground that would shift and crack come spring thaw. You might as well build your house on a boat in a storm. At Fort Laramie, construction foreman Marcus Webb spent his evenings calculating the brutal arithmetic of this ancient law. 7 months of potential building squeezed into 5. That meant rushed work, inflated prices for materials that had to be stockpiled through winter, and strategic disadvantages against the British Hudson Bay Company operations that somehow times managed year-round construction up in Canada. Each lost winter day cost the American Fur Company approximately $500 in today's money. Multiply that by 150 days of winter, and you're looking at $75,000 of lost opportunity every single year. The fort's expansion plans gathered dust while competitors claimed prime territory along the Columbia River and in Oregon Territory. Into this frozen stalemate rode a man who would change everything. January 3rd, 1835. Picture this scene. A lone rider approaches Bridger's trading post through a howling snowstorm. Ice has crystallized in his wild beard, turning it white as mountain granite. Frostbite has claimed 2 fingertips on his left hand, but he's still gripping the reins. His Tennessee drawl cuts through the wind as he makes an announcement that will sound absolutely insane to everyone present. His name was Josiah Thornberry, and he announced to the gathered trappers that he would build a complete cabin, not a lean-to, not a dugout, but a full cabin with 4 walls and a proper roof before February's new moon. In the killing heart of winter, in temperatures that could freeze a man's spit before it hit the ground, the laughter started immediately. These were men who'd spent years learning winter's rules the hard way. Tom Beaver Johnson, who'd lost 3 toes to frostbite the previous winter, bet his entire season's pelts worth about $15,000 today that Joe wouldn't last 3 days. French-Canadian voyageur Baptiste Dufresne, a man who'd paddled through ice floes on Hudson Bay, offered 5 prime horses. Even Jim Bridger himself, the legendary mountain man who'd discovered the Great Salt Lake, threw in a custom Hawken rifle worth more than most men made in a year. They all knew Mad Joe, as they immediately christened him, would fail. Had to fail. Winter building wasn't just difficult or challenging or risky. It was death, pure and simple. The mountains had been teaching that lesson for thousands of years, and the tuition was paid in frozen blood. But here's the thing about revolutions. They often begin with someone refusing to accept what everyone knows to be impossible. Someone who's learned different rules, or found a way around the old ones. And Josiah Thornberry had learned something in the mountains of eastern Tennessee that none of these Rocky Mountain veterans had ever heard of. Something the Cherokee had been doing for generations. Something that was about to turn the entire logic of frontier construction upside down and inside out. What was this secret? How do you build when nature herself seems determined to kill you for trying? And why hadn't anyone else figured this out in all the centuries people had been fighting winter in North America? Well, As Joe unpacked his tools that first morning and began doing things no mountain man had ever seen before, the answers to those questions would reshape not just how cabins were built, but how an entire continent was settled. Joe's madness had method. That method had been learned in the mountains of eastern Tennessee from a Cherokee builder named Joseph Ridge, who remembered techniques his grandfather's grandfather had used to construct winter lodges that could withstand the brutal mountain storms that swept down from what we now call the Great Smoky Mountains. This wasn't some romantic notion of indigenous wisdom. This was engineering, pure and practical, refined over centuries of trial and error where failure meant death. The secret began with preparation that would have impressed a modern logistics coordinator. During October's last warmth, when sap ran lowest and wood fiber was most stable, Joe selected and cut his logs with mathematical precision. But here's where it gets interesting. Instead of stacking them exposed to winter's punishment like every other frontier builder, Joe excavated specialized storage caves. These weren't random holes in the ground. Each cave maintained precise temperatures just above freezing around 35 degrees Fahrenheit. The Cherokee had discovered that this specific temperature range prevented the cellular damage that occurred when wood froze and thawed repeatedly. Think of it like this. When water inside wood cells freezes, it expands, cracking the cellular structure. But keep that wood just above freezing, and you maintain structural integrity through the entire winter. But Joe's preparation went further. He treated each log with a carefully mixed compound of bear fat and crushed juniper berries, a combination that created a natural waterproofing seal. The bear fat penetrated the wood grain, while the juniper berries contained natural preservatives that prevented rot and insect damage. This treatment sealed the wood against moisture that would expand and crack in freezing temperatures, essentially creating what we might recognize today as pressure-treated lumber. On January 7, 1835, Joe began construction. What happened next stunned every observer at Bridger's trading post. His foundation technique violated everything these mountain men thought they knew about winter building. Instead of trying to dig through frozen earth, an impossible task that had defeated countless attempts, Joe built fires in strategic geometric patterns across his chosen site. But these weren't random blazes. He fed them with a specific mixture of pine and aspen that burned steady and low, maintaining consistent heat without the explosive temperature spikes that would crack stones or create uneven ground thaw. Flat stones gathered from Wind River, selected for their heat retention properties, stored and radiated warmth in a carefully planned grid. Think of it as a primitive radiant heating system. The stones would absorb heat during the day when fires burned, then release that stored thermal energy slowly through the night, maintaining ground temperature even when the fires died down. But the true innovation, the breakthrough that would change everything, came from his mortar. Joe guarded this recipe like a state secret, but we know it contained pine resin, bear fat, crushed limestone from specific deposits near South Pass, and mysteriously, ground buffalo horn. This mixture remained workable at 20 degrees below zero temperatures that would turn ordinary mortar into useless frozen chunks. More incredibly, it set harder than conventional mortar, creating bonds that actually strengthened in cold weather rather than weakening. Baptiste Dufresne, the French-Canadian voyageur who'd initially bet against Joe, became his first convert after watching him frame an entire wall in a single day during a blizzard. Baptiste had spent years in the lumber camps of Quebec, and he recognized efficiency when he saw it. Joe's logs fit together like pieces of a Chinese puzzle, each marked with charcoal symbols indicating exact placement, angle, and orientation. No wasted motion, no frozen fingers fumbling with sizing cuts, no delays waiting for weather to clear. Joe worked through conditions that would have sent conventional builders scrambling for shelter. By January 20th, as temperatures plunged to minus 30 degrees Fahrenheit, Joe's cabin stood half complete, while growing crowds of doubters gathered daily, expecting catastrophic collapse. The crisis that would prove or destroy Joe's methods arrived January 25th. A 3-day blizzard swept down from the Yellowstone Plateau, bringing winds that reached 60 miles per hour and temperatures that dropped to minus 40 degrees. Snow fell so thick that visibility dropped to arm's length. Conventional wisdom said, wait it out, huddle by the fire, and pray your shelter held. But Joe worked through it. By torchlight and sheer determination, he continued construction. His heated foundation system proved its worth during this brutal test. While conventional buildings across the region saw ground frost heave and crack their foundations like eggshells, Joe's foundation stayed stable. The radiant heat from his stone grid prevented the freeze-thaw cycles that destroyed ordinary construction. Agnes Morrison, Fort Laramie's unofficial chronicler and the wife of a supply contractor, documented this marathon construction effort in letters to her sister back in Pittsburgh. For 72 hours straight, Joe and his converts, now including Baptiste, and surprisingly, 2 Shoshone observers who'd arrived to witness this violation of winter's laws, battled wind and snow that would have killed unprepared men within hours. When the storm finally cleared on January 28th, something impossible stood steaming in the morning sunlight, a complete cabin. 4 walls, a roof, a working chimney sending smoke into the crystal-clear air. While snowdrifts reached the eaves and icicles hung like prison bars from every building at the trading post, Joe's structure looked solid as summer construction. Tom Beaver Johnson walked around the cabin 3 times, testing corners, checking joints, looking for any sign of weakness or future failure. He found none. Baptiste Dufresne pressed his ear against the walls, listening for settling creaks or stress sounds. Silence. Even Jim Bridger himself, who'd seen mountain men attempt impossible things for 20 years, could only shake his head and mutter, "Well, I'll be damned." But this was just the beginning. Word of Joe's achievement was about to spread faster than wildfire through every trading post, fort, and settlement from the Missouri River to the Pacific coast. And what started as one man's refusal to accept winter's limitations was about to become a revolution that would reshape how America built itself across an entire continent. Word traveled faster than spring melt. By February, trappers from as far as the Snake River and the Platte were riding through blizzards to see Joe's impossible cabin. They came expecting to find collapsed walls or cracked foundations, proof that winter's laws couldn't be broken. Instead, they found a structure that looked like it had been built in July. Solid corners, tight chinking, a chimney that drew perfectly, and Joe himself, warm and comfortable inside, working on furniture while other men were still rationing firewood and praying for spring. But Joe was selective about who learned his methods. This wasn't arrogance, it was wisdom born from understanding that powerful knowledge required responsible stewardship. He required potential students to demonstrate respect for both the technique and the indigenous wisdom behind it. You couldn't just throw money at Joe Thornberry and walk away with Cherokee building secrets. You had to prove you understood that this knowledge came from a people who'd been engineering solutions to winter's challenges for centuries before any Europeans set foot in North America. Sarah and Marcus Webb became his first merchant students, but not because they offered the most money. Marcus had spent 2 winters helping Shoshone families repair their lodges, working without payment because he understood that survival in the mountains meant cooperation across cultural lines. Sarah had learned to speak basic Cherokee during trading expeditions, showing the kind of respect that impressed Joe. When they approached him about learning winter construction, they came offering partnership, not purchase. The Webbs saw opportunity where others saw only survival. They established the first winter construction supply depot at Fort Laramie, standardizing Joe's limestone mixture and creating what would become the Mountain West's first building supply chain operating year-round. Think about the revolutionary nature of this development. For the first time in the history of North American frontier settlement, builders could access specialized materials and tools during winter months. Their depot stocked pre-treated logs, barrels of the special mortar mixture, heating, stones selected for optimal thermal retention, and even the specific grades of bear fat and juniper berries needed for wood preservation. Prices were steep, about 3 times summer costs, but for builders who could work year-round, the economics made perfect sense. Build in winter, charge premium prices for urgent construction, and dominate markets that had previously been impossible to serve. The real test of Joe's revolution came during the legendary blizzard of February 1836. This wasn't just another winter storm. Weather records from military posts across the territory, documented wind speeds exceeding 70 miles per hour, and temperatures that plunged to -50 degrees Fahrenheit. Snow fell for 8 straight days, accumulating to depths of 6 feet on level ground and creating drifts that buried entire buildings. In the Green River Valley, where 27 families had built cabins using Joe's methods over the previous year, this storm would prove whether Cherokee engineering could withstand nature's absolute worst. When the storm finally cleared, the results were devastating and decisive. 11 traditional structures had collapsed completely, their roofs crushed under snow loads their builders never anticipated. 8 people died, including 3 children. But every single cabin built using Joe's techniques stood solid. Not just standing, thriving. Families inside reported staying comfortable throughout the storm, their heated foundations preventing the ground freeze that had destabilized conventional buildings. Mary Patterson, whose family had sheltered in a Joe-built cabin during the storm, wrote to her sister in Missouri with words that would be quoted in newspapers from St. Louis to New York, *. The walls sang in the wind but never shook. We stayed warm as August while death howled outside. Our neighbors who mocked this Cherokee building now beg to learn it, but 3 lie buried beneath the snow. *. But success bred competition, and not all of it was friendly. Traditional builders felt their livelihoods threatened by techniques that made their skills obsolete. Jacob Müller, a German craftsman with 20 years of experience and a reputation for the finest traditional log work from the Missouri River to the Continental Divide, issued a public challenge to Joe in December 1836. A building duel. 2 cabins, side by side, built simultaneously through the worst month of winter. Traditional methods against Cherokee innovation. Müller brought impressive credentials. He'd trained in the Black Forest region of Germany, where winter construction had been attempted for centuries. He adapted traditional European techniques for American cold, using methods his grandfather had employed building alpine chalets. His plan involved portable forges for ground thawing, imported German mortars designed for cold weather, and a crew of experienced craftsmen who'd worked through Rhine Valley winters. Joe employed his full system, now refined with improvements suggested by Cherokee advisors who had traveled from Tennessee specifically to witness their students' growing success. Joseph Ridge himself arrived for the competition, bringing additional techniques that Joe had never learned. The Cherokee delegation viewed this contest as an opportunity to demonstrate that indigenous knowledge could compete with any European tradition. The result was decisive and somewhat embarrassing for Müller. Joe's cabin stood complete in 12 days, with time to spare for finishing touches like built-in furniture and decorative chinking patterns. Müller's cabin remained unfinished after 3 weeks of exhausting labor, finally abandoned when repeated freeze-thaw cycles cracked his foundation beyond repair. His imported mortar, designed for European conditions, couldn't handle the extreme temperature swings of Rocky Mountain winter. By 1837, the transformation was becoming an economic revolution that extended far beyond individual cabins. The Sublette Brothers trading empire, which controlled fur commerce across vast territories, adopted winter building techniques wholesale. They trained specialized crews who could erect a complete trading post in 6 weeks of January cold, allowing rapid expansion into territories that had previously been inaccessible during peak trapping season. Their competitive advantage became overwhelming, while rival companies waited for spring to build new posts. Sublette crews were already established and trading. Property values shifted dramatically. Winter-accessible building sites commanded premium prices, sometimes doubling in value overnight. Land speculators began mapping territories based on new criteria: proximity to limestone deposits, availability of heat retention stones, and access to bear populations for fat harvesting. The Oregon Trail's development accelerated exponentially as way stations and supply depots could be erected year-round instead of waiting for seasonal construction windows. Maps of the American West began changing monthly instead of annually. New settlements appeared throughout winter, established by builders who could work in conditions that had previously been considered impossible. The pace of westward expansion increased dramatically, as pioneers could build shelter immediately upon arrival, rather than waiting months for suitable weather. And yet, this was still only the beginning. Joe Thornbury's winter-building revolution was about to escape the confines of frontier cabins and trading posts, spreading into projects and territories that would reshape the entire trajectory of American expansion. The techniques born from Cherokee wisdom were about to change not just how buildings rose, but how a nation grew. Joe Thornbury vanished into the Wind River Range during the winter of 1838, leaving behind only a cryptic note. Asterisk, higher mountains hold deeper secrets. Asterisk, some say he went searching for Cherokee relatives who had moved west during the forced removals. Others believe he was pursuing rumors of Russian fur traders from Alaska who possessed their own Arctic construction methods. The truth is, nobody knows what happened to Josiah Thornbury, but by the time he disappeared, his revolution had already escaped his control entirely. By 1840, transcontinental railroad surveys specifically sought engineers trained in winter construction. Think about the implications of this development. Railroad companies realized that crews capable of working year-round could lay track through mountain passes during seasons when conventional construction was impossible. The entire timeline of connecting East and West accelerated because builders could work when others couldn't. The California Gold Rush of 1849 succeeded partly because miners arriving in the Sierra Nevada could build year-round settlements instead of seasonal camps, while fortune seekers using traditional methods spent months waiting for spring to construct permanent housing. Miners trained in Joe's techniques erected stable communities through the brutal mountain winters. This created the foundation for California's explosive growth. Permanent towns, instead of temporary camps, meant families, businesses, and lasting civilization. But the cultural impact ran deeper than economics or territorial expansion. Winter building festivals became courtship traditions across frontier communities, where young men demonstrated their worthiness as husbands by successfully raising cabin frames in freezing temperatures. These weren't just social gatherings, they were practical demonstrations of survival skills that could mean the difference between life and death for frontier families. A man who could build in winter could provide shelter when it mattered most. Women developed their own expertise, creating the Guild of Resin Keepers who guarded and continuously improved mortar recipes. These women became the technical specialists of winter construction, developing variations of Joe's original formula adapted to different climates and available materials. From Montana to Colorado, each regional guild maintained secret modifications that gave their communities construction advantages. Children learned mathematics through log marking systems and geometry through foundation patterns. Winter construction became an educational tool that taught practical skills while embedding technical knowledge in entire generations. Kids who grew up understanding thermal dynamics and structural engineering principles would carry that knowledge into adulthood, creating a population uniquely equipped for frontier challenges. The phrase *winter built* entered American English, meaning something unshakable, permanent, trustworthy. Buildings described as winter-built commanded higher prices. Marriages were praised as winter-built when they endured hardship. Even business partnerships adopted the term to indicate reliability under pressure. Joe's construction techniques had created a metaphor for American resilience itself. Modern analysis reveals that Joe's techniques anticipated several engineering principles not formally understood until the 20th century. His heated foundation system prevented frost heave through uniform temperature distribution, a principle that wouldn't be scientifically documented until 1923. His pre-treatment process with bear fat and juniper berries essentially created primitive pressure-treated lumber, anticipating chemical wood preservation by nearly a century. The limestone pine resin mortar exhibited properties remarkably similar to modern cold-weather concrete additives developed in the 1960s. In January 2024, archaeologist Dr. Rebecca Chen discovered a sealed cave near South Pass, containing Joe's personal journals and detailed construction diagrams. The writings revealed correspondence with Cherokee engineers, British military builders familiar with Arctic construction, and mysteriously, Russian fur traders from Alaska who possessed their own cold-weather building methods. Joe had been assembling a comprehensive system drawn from multiple indigenous and frontier traditions, a kind of international encyclopedia of cold-weather construction. His final journal entry, dated December 1st, 1838, hints at one last innovation that was never completed. Asterisk. The mountains have shown me how to build with wind itself as my ally, not my enemy. Tomorrow I test the spiral foundation. If this works, cities themselves might rise in winter. Asterisk. We'll never know what Joe discovered in those final experiments, but his documented techniques continued evolving long after his disappearance. The spiral foundation he mentioned influenced 20th-century skyscraper design. His thermal management principles appear in modern geothermal heating systems. Even NASA has studied his wood preservation methods for potential use in space construction. Today, visitors to the Museum of Mountain Heritage in Jackson Hole can see reconstructions of Joe's original cabin, built using his exact methods recovered from those discovered journals. Every January, master builders demonstrate the techniques in live exhibitions, keeping alive the revolution that began when one man refused to accept that winter meant waiting. The Cherokee knowledge that Joe learned from Joseph Ridge, adapted through his own innovations, and spread across a continent changed more than construction techniques. It changed how Americans thought about limitations, about seasonal constraints, about the relationship between indigenous wisdom and frontier necessity. In those frozen months of 1834 and 1835, when Samuel Hayes died watching winter crush his shelter and Joe Thornberry announced his impossible plan, nobody could have predicted the scale of transformation that would follow. But that's how revolutions work. They begin with someone refusing to accept the word asterisk, impossible, asterisk, and end by rewriting the rules everyone thought were carved in stone, or in this case, carved in frozen earth.